Hello and welcome to Unprofessional Engineering. My name is James.
You got Luke.
Luke, I have a pressing question for you, and it's been pressing for years, decades,
Oh no.
maybe since the beginning of time. Why is Venice sinking?
That's really the question you have.
That's the
for me,
question I
James?
have that we want to answer today.
Well, so whenever whenever you were sending me over the image for this, you were like, "Oh, I don't want this to be clickbait." And I was like, "I love clickbait, so let's just call this episode Venice is Sinking." So let's get it right out from the get-go, James. Venice is technically sinking.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that statement.
The sea level is also rising at the same time.
Also true.
So I think when you take those two things together, that's like a perfect storm for like bad news for the Venetian people.
The very few Venetian people that are left, apparently.
Goodness gracious. It's
all right,
bananas.
let's not spoil it all.
Let's not.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the history of Venice?
Okay.
The lengthy history
yeah,
of Venice.
It was painfully long. Yeah, so here's what happened essentially, and I'm going to abbreviate this, James. You know me. I'm not one for details. So right around, I don't know, 452 AD. This is why the history of Venice was so terrible, because of just how long it was. So basically, these barbarians were basically sacking Roman cities. These are essentially like Vikings and all these. I think they call it, led by Attila. I'm guessing that's Attila the Hun. So maybe it's not Vikings.
I don't know too many Attilas other than him.
So it is the Huns.
Long-time listener.
I'm reading it now. It is Attila the Hun. So Attila the Hun is basically sacking all these Roman cities.
Okay.
And all these people in Italy, kind of up above the boot, they're like, we got to get out of here. So they crowd to this marshy area. So if you're looking at the boot of Italy and you got the Adriatic Sea going there at the very tippy top of the Adriatic Sea, up by the bottom of the boot where like the butt would be if it was a leg, that is where Venice is essentially. And up in that corner, it's basically just a giant marshland swamp, a whole bunch of little islands all over the place. And this is where like fishermen and salt workers used to live. But then, Attila the Hun shows up. All these people start fleeing there for safety and protection to get away from them. So eventually this just turns into like a little tiny ad hoc city, essentially. And then what happens over the years, and this is why it just got so difficult. So they start to build, and we'll get into the building process a little bit later. We want to make sure we do the history. So in the 7th and 9th centuries, they get really famous for like glass making. Within this time, they're underneath the care of the Byzantine Empire. And what happens right around 726 AD is they're like, you know what? We're tired of being a part of the Byzantine Empire. We actually want to be our own empire. So they elect this cat named Orzo, which I'm guessing is where the pasta name comes from. Orzo Apalto.
You're just making all the connections. I like it.
So Orzo Apalto becomes the very first Venetian. They called him a doge. This was basically like a dictator or a ruler, whatever it is, without asking Constantinople, which was basically the hub of the Byzantine Empire. And it's like this major catastrophe. So all of a sudden, you got this independent Venetian nation that is operating independent of they're basically like in the middle of everything. The Byzantine Empire was all around them, but they were pretty popular. So lots and lots of battles are going back and forth. Eventually, the Venetians take all this, these folks, they called them Franks. They were, I think, German warriors. And they end up actually attacking Constantinople. And they take all of they called it booty at the time, all of their stuff. They took all their like golden statues and bronze horses and artifacts, and they bring this all back to to Venice. And essentially, there's just some major turmoil between the Venetian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And in between all of this time, and I never knew this, they're taking over parts of modern day Croatia, like they're taking over parts of like Dalmatia and
islands
Crete.
all over.
So
Yeah.
I never knew that there was like a Venetian empire. I thought it was Venice. Apparently, like if you're looking again at that Adriatic Sea, the whole inside of the boot where Venice is, the basically where Croatia's coastline is down into Crete. So they basically owned all of that for years and years and years. Eventually, it starts going back and forth, and somehow little Napoleon Bonaparte gets involved. So I don't have the exact year. Do you have the year? I have it here in my timeline.
So the
somewhere.
Republic came to an end in 1797, and that's when Napoleon and his armies were like, "Hey, look at this great city." But
So 1797, Napoleon comes in, extinguishes the Venetian Empire, and Napoleon then starts to suppress all, like the religious stuff that they're doing. And then it takes all the way from 1797 all the way to 1866. So a whole bunch of stuff happens in between there. It's not even really worth like talking about. But eventually in 1866, Venice joins the kingdom at the time of Italy and unifies all of Italy, making Rome its capital, ultimately in 1870. So now Venice is actually a part of Italy at this time and has been thereafter.
I really appreciate your history. A few things that I wanted to call out. My version of this history started with Venice was basically the European end of the Silk Road, if anybody remembers that from history class, which basically moved goods from China. Then I read a bunch of stuff and I was like, ugh. And I said, literally, I wrote centuries of unrest, including Lombards, Byzantines, anti-Byzantines, and pro-Byzantines. Yeah. And that was my history until I got to Napoleon, because it was just so back and forth and so all over the place. But one thing I want to point out is like, I've made it very clear that I'm an ignorant American, right?
Yes.
Italy wasn't like a thing. Like all the time. Like I always just think of like, England was England and France was France, Spain was Spain. Obviously, Italy is Italy. Turns out that wasn't the case. Like 1800s isn't that long ago. That's less than 200 years ago that this was happening still. So,
I think there's this assumption because, the US is such a young nation.
Right.
We just assume that like everything in Europe is like centuries old, and it isn't always.
No, it absolutely, well, I guess all the stuff is, it's just all of the other things. But yeah, so like you said, Venice current day is just like a group of islands. I think it's 188.
Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Somewhere in that neck of the wood, or 118, I'm sorry, islands make up Venice. Just all connected together, or taking the stupid boats all over the place.
Gondolas.
Like you said, gondolas, yes.
You say gondolas or gondola?
I say gondola.
Gondola. Yeah. I think that's how you're supposed to say it.
I don't know. I'm not Italian, so.
So fun. Hold on. So I want to stop you there. So I take this DNA test, right? I think I told you about it, and you told me that they probably made a duplicate of me somewhere in some lab. But I did one of those DNA tests. It tells me I'm like 85% Croatian, and I'm super excited, which we knew. I get this email that says, "Hey, there's been an update to our algorithm. Go check it out." I check the algorithm out here. I'm now like 80% Italian, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, how does that just change from like one algorithm?
I know.
So currently I am mostly Italian. I think I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of like 75% Italian or something.
Oh,
There's a little bit, there's some Croatian, there's some German, there's some other things in there. And my family doesn't believe me. They're like, oh no, that's wrong. I'm like,
science is wrong.
I was like, it said Croatian like a month ago, and now it's like Italian. So,
well, I could understand why someone might question that. I did that as well. And like, obviously, big part German, Herzing, very German, got it. But then the other part, it was like, you're Irish-ish, something like that. And it comes back and it's like, you're basically a Viking. You're like all the Nordics, like, is you. And what I figure it has to be, as you look at my not red hair and, everything anyone's ever told me, is that like the Nordic people came and conquered all these lands. So like me saying I'm Irish or English or something isn't incorrect. It's just that, you know, the way they do it, the Nordic people is probably what they trace it back to. And they were in those regions at that time.
Exactly.
So that's what I figure. All right. Before we get into more about Venice, why it's sinking, and what they're doing about it, most importantly, I suppose, let's take a break for a word from our sponsor.
We're brought to you by Venice.com.
We love your tourism. Please stay away.
Exactly. No, we are not brought to you by Venice.com. And quit going, everybody. No sponsor this week, unfortunately.
No sponsor. But we do have some shout outs.
Let's hear them.
Number one, RT3 from Ohio. Not to be confused with RG3. That basically lives in Kentucky, 10 minutes away from the border, from what I can tell. Likes to laugh at our expert pronunciation, especially during episodes like the BMW one, which has all the fun names in there. Also suggested that we cover the Erie Canal, which might be an interesting one. I'm surprised we haven't, since it's so close to home.
It's like literally like right up there.
Yeah. And actually, this is kind of interesting. His aunt has a bakery on the property that the Erie Canal runs through. So that's kind of cool.
I might have to go get some baked goods.
Do an on-site episode, right? Okay, and then this one I'm going to really botch. Istvan P. Sorry about that. Might be our only listener in Hungary, so that's cool. Already has over 30 episodes in, even though just messaged last week that they found us. So keep up the good listening and grow our listenership there, right?
There you go.
And one shout out for you, Luke. Not really. I just wanted to give you the information that based off of all of our amazing fans purchasing stuff from our webpage after clicking an Amazon ad, I believe we have now raked in a total of $21.88.
I will expect my check tomorrow in the mail.
I realized that I don't know where that money goes. So when I find it, I will get you your $10.94.
Oh, goodness.
If any of you want to support us by giving us large sums of cash, want to sponsor us, want to just say hello, get some amazing stickers, get a shout out, all those good things, email us directly at unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and make sure you do reviews. We love the reviews. And as always, make sure you tell your smart devices to play the Unprofessional Engineering Podcast.
All right. So now to the hook. Why is Venice sinking?
Yeah.
So you gave us a little lead in that, hey, it is sinking and the water's rising. Bad combination for a bunch of islands, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. So fun fact. I don't know if it's
is it fun?
So Venice is at an elevation of 3 feet. That means
it's like nothing.
That means here's sea level, and literally they are 3 feet above sea level. So if you have a 3-foot wave, all of a sudden you now have flooding happening. Or if you have high tide or low tide, you have that happening. So probably not the best place to build a city. But they built it in a pretty interesting way, James.
They did. And before you get into the details of how they built it, if you haven't been to Venice, it's kind of like being at the beach.
Were you know there?
How I was there.
Okay.
I'll give you a story about it here later on, I guess, but my experience, which maybe wasn't positive. At the beach, you just kind of walk and it slopes down straight into the water and go. That's basically all of Venice. Everything slopes right into the water. There's some spots that have a little wall that kind of separates it, but for the most part, the gondolas, depending on who you are parked right there. So you just walk right onto them. They have little docks everywhere because, like you're saying, there's just no difference between where it's built and the water level. It's crazy.
So are we going to talk about how they're built?
Let me hear how it's built, please.
Okay. So imagine that you're, back in whatever it was, 425 AD or 452 AD.
Yeah.
It's okay, I got to build a house on a marsh. So what do I do? So I take a tree, I cut all the limbs off, I turn that tree upside down, and I jam it in the ground point first.
Over and over.
over and over and over. It's estimated, James, that there are over 1 million wooden piles driven into the marshy, muddy soil all over Venice. And it's the reason why I say it's an estimate is they don't know exactly how many. They do have a couple that they know accurately. So one example is there's 12,000 that support the weight of the Retalio Bridge. So there's a really famous bridge there.
It's a cool bridge, yeah.
So there's 12,000 just for that bridge. And my guess is they probably did some kind of estimate, like each house needs this much. But essentially what they do, if you think about this construction process, they take these trees essentially, and they were made out of cedar, elder, and I forget there's another type of tree they did it with. There were like 3 types of trees, and they drive them into the ground, and then they cut them all even, and they essentially built a platform that literally every single structure in Venice is basically on a wooden pile. And even to this day, when they build the piles, they make them out of wood. Because did you know, James, that wood will not rot without the presence of oxygen?
Did I know that before a couple of days ago? Is that what you're asking?
I'm sure you knew that just offhand. Apparently the reason why this works is there's there's oxygen in water, but not oxygen like the way we think of oxygen.
Right.
It's and the wood will not rot because it needs air for it to rot. So as long as it stays completely submerged, they never, ever, ever rot. And actually, they become petrified, which I can talk about in a minute. So imagine over the years, Venice, essentially, if you wanted to build a house, you would take a couple years and you would drive these piles into the ground, and then you would build your platform and literally think about the size of some of these palaces and some of these basilicas and churches. I mean, they're made out of granite. I mean, it's a pretty crazy engineering feat if you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like that's got to be some of the problem, right? It's like, running away for your lives and like settling in this marshy area, you're not thinking, you know what we're going to eventually do? Build these monstrous churches and cathedrals and everything and have to support them on the marsh, right?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. You're right, though. What an amazing engineering feat.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, that's interesting about they specifically chose marble, which is like crazy heavy because it's pretty much impervious to water. If they would have chose like really any other kind of material like sandstone or any other kind of like rock
styrofoam.
Or brick, or it just is styrofoam. I don't know if that existed back then. It just wouldn't have held up the way that granite held up. So that's essentially how it's done. And some of the pictures I've seen. So imagine, you and I, James, we're both pretty strong, burly men.
True.
Right?
Very true.
Imagine you and I holding essentially an upside down bucket that's weighted, and there's little handles on the outside of the bucket. And you take that bucket and you put it on the end of a tree, not a small tree. I'm talking a tree that's like
a monster tree,
24 inches, 36 inches diameter. And you and I just stand there for days and days and days with these weighted buckets, slamming it down in the ground. I saw a video how they do it now, and they do it from a barge with a weight. And it looks really similar to how they drive the metal piles for guardrails. It looks really similar. They just drive into the ground super easy. So that's essentially how Venice was built.
That's crazy. I mean, we would probably be able to do that rather quickly ourselves, but most people probably would struggle with that. I don't know where you want to go with this next, but I was going to throw out there that they've been doing studies and watching the cities sinking, right? But in the early 2000s, they did some studies. So a lot of the sinking was caused because of groundwater being pumped out. And then they stopped doing that. They're like, oh crap, this is a problem. They stopped doing that in the 2000s. They did some studies and they're like, oh sweet, the subsiding has stopped. This is all wonderful, right? But then they started doing new studies. And officially March 28th in 2012, they published something in an amazing sounding journal, Geochemistry, Geophysics, Geosystems.
Nice.
Like, who wouldn't want to read that?
I'm a subscriber.
Are you? I figured as much. You all know our love for civil engineers, so it makes good sense that we would want to read that. But it used a whole bunch of different measurement techniques, including GPS, which had gotten more and more reliable and accurate. And then they were like, oh crap, still sinking. Like
Yeah.
bad things are still happening. And keep in mind that this isn't the part that would necessarily have to do with the water levels raising from the ocean. This is actually from the building was at this point and now it's at this point from the GPS readings that they were doing. So back in 2012 is when they were once again like, uh-oh, we need to come up with a solution for this.
Did you see? I saw a number that said it's 1 to 2 millimeters per year.
So it ranges. So on average, they say 1 to 2 millimeters per year for our English folks here, 0.04 to 0.08 inches per year. Feels pretty small, but that adds up over time,
Yeah.
especially when you only have a few feet to work with, right? But there's also patches of land in the lagoon that it's built on that are sinking even more so. So, like the northern section of it is dropping at 2 to 3 millimeters, so a little bit faster. And then the southern side of the lagoon is dropping at 3 to 4. So now we're talking 0.16 inches per year for the southern part.
That's a lot.
That's a lot when you don't have a lot of wiggle room. And there's no sign of it stopping anytime soon. But what's also really strange, and I know we have to just take a quick break here in a second, but the team also found that not only is it sinking, but it's also starting to tilt a little bit. It's tilting about 1 to 2 millimeters eastward each year. So that means that the western side of the city is actually higher than the other side. So not only is it sinking down into the ground, but it's also turning sideways, which again, if you have a fair amount of slope going on there after a few years, this could be a major
it's
problem.
going to be terrible.
For the buildings falling apart, for the roadway, well, what they call roadways.
Yeah, they don't have roadways.
Everything. Yeah. Okay, so before we get into more stuff here, how about we take a break for this week's Luke's rant?
Here's my rant.
Uh-oh.
Don't go to Venice. So, and I know you went. So
I did.
So you went to Venice.
Sorry, Venetians.
You are the part of the problem, James.
I'm most of the problem.
So here's the problem with tourism in Venice. And I watched a couple videos about this, and I think I mentioned this one before. So there's this food series called Somebody Feed Phil. It's the producer from Everybody Loves Raymond. He visited Venice and he talked to like the Venetian people about how they feel about tourism and what it's doing. So tourism is essentially destroying Venice right now. The population of Venice, I think the last number I saw, it was like 30,000 or something like that. It was incredibly low. And the reason being, it's super expensive to live there because the building upkeep and what you have to do to maintain the building so that they, don't fall down or sink or it's all on the building owners. But essentially, these cruise ships come in and they drop off 30,000 people in one day. The people go to Venice, they walk around, they take a bunch of pictures, they don't spend any money because guess what? They get free booze and food on the cruise ship, and then they go back onto the cruise ship. They don't stay in hotels. They very rarely spend, large amounts of money. And it's just this enormous drain on the Venetian economy. And actually, I heard they just started doing a tax. Like if you're coming in from a cruise ship,
it's a hefty tax.
You have to pay it's like an entry fee. And they're saying that this is essentially going to turn Venice into a giant museum. People will stop living there. There will be, or an amusement park. There'll be restaurants, there'll be stores, but people won't live in Venice. It'll be 100% a tourist attraction that you pay to get into. You spend the day and then you leave, kind of thing, which is terrible.
Yeah. In my defense, I did not come on a cruise ship. I stayed there.
You swam.
And I swam there, yes. And I spent my fair share of money on booze, as I tend to do, as well as
Did you
on
stay
food.
In Venice?
Yeah, I stayed in Venice.
At a hotel?
I stayed at a person's Airbnb. So part of the problem still, I get it. But right in the center, it was awesome.
Okay.
Here's my statement about all this. Venice, you kind of suck. You're doing this to yourself.
They are.
You're stuck out there doing nothing. You want to get somewhere outside of Venice, you have to walk a little bit. You have to jump on a boat. You might have to jump on a second boat. You have to take a bus. Like, it's so out there. It's so difficult to get around. It stinks. It floods. Yeah, who wants to live there?
Yeah.
Fun fact for you, Luke, since
Shoot.
I'm all up in arms and being feisty, and this isn't really what we're going to call a fun fact, but for me it is. The city has these great barriers that we're going to talk about for floods. But you know what? Homes aren't even hooked up to a modern sewage system. You know what their sewage system is? They flush the old toilet and boom, into the canals it goes.
The turds go right in the canal.
Untreated, gross poo water, as you like to say, goes right into the canals, and twice a day with the tide, it gets swept out.
Well,
that's
disgusting. Gets swept out.
It's disgusting, and you can tell that happens.
I noticed that in the Spider-Man Far From Home, which was one of my more favorite Spider-Mans.
Well, there we go. All right. So I know we're running out of time. So let's get moving on with why it's sinking and what are they doing about it.
Okay. So
one more thing about why it's sinking from my side. Plate tectonics is coming into play here. The Adriatic plate is where Venice sits, and it's sliding underneath one of its neighboring plates in the mountains over there. Apennines, something like that.
Nailed it.
And that's causing the elevation to drop. The compaction of the sediment underneath Venice also remains a factor. So again, they built this on a marsh, which, the rivers and stuff would have continued to fill that land up with silt and other soft stuff, but they kind of stopped that process. And it didn't give time for everything to settle. So it's still compacting. Normally that stuff would happen over thousands and thousands of years naturally. Well, humans went in and stopped that. Yeah. And now we're getting, the bad side of things.
So the other thing too that's happening is some of the wooden piles, they've actually become petrified. And the process of petrification is because there isn't oxygen and it's not decaying the way wood would decay normally under, just being out near oxygen. What happens is minerals replace the wood as it's decaying, and essentially the wood doesn't exist anymore, but there is a mineral shaped, pile that's there. And these things aren't they're not really good with, they're good with static load. They're okay with static, but anytime there's any kind of shifts or movement, they're extremely brittle. They're not elastic. They're like wood has a little bit of give, but as soon as these things become petrified, there's very little give to these. Very similar to concrete.
Yeah, it's not unlike what we hear about in San Francisco, in my opinion, where you see some of their giant skyscrapers starting to tilt, and they're trying to figure out ways to like pump foam and other stuff underneath them to keep that from happening. Ugh, terrible.
So, so not only is it physically sinking, the other thing too is, climate change is happening, whether you believe it or not. Yeah. And what's happening is,
hold on, let's put out like a disclaimer. We're not saying it's happening. We're not saying it's not happening. We're not saying it's not a natural part of things. We don't need angry emails. We're just saying the water levels are rising.
The water so we can scientifically measure that water levels are rising, and I think we all agree that that's happening. So when you take a sinking city, we only got like 3 feet of play with tides, and then you take rising sea levels, that's going to be a huge problem. So what happened is back in, I think it was 2000, was it 13, James, or 2008? They came up with this idea of making this thing called the MOSE. MOSES, is that what it's called?
This was 1976.
Yeah, but when they started building it.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah. So 1976.
So that's when they announced this idea. Was 1976. MOSE, the Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico.
Yep, nailed it. Basically, it's this thing that kind of pops up whenever the tides get high. I don't know why they didn't call it that.
I don't know either.
But essentially, so I think the construction of this started in 2008. I'm trying to find my notes here. So it was 2003 is whenever they started constructing this thing to prevent flooding. And essentially what this is, imagine giant metal baffles out in the bay, and they're filled with water. Whenever the high tide comes in, they pump the water out. Because they're hollow and filled with air, they tip straight up. and then the high tide stays behind it. The regular level of Venice is on this side of it. Whenever the high tide is over, they pump water back into them, and then sea level and the level of Venice is at the same. The problem is just recently,
There's a lot of problems.
Yeah, December 2020, I think it was December 9th, somewhere around there. The alarm goes off, high tide's coming in. This system totally fails and doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do.
I feel like you're selling it short.
Okay,
so
okay, let me hear it.
So before that, I think it was in August, give or take, this all happened. They raised the alarms, they raised the wall, and it kept everybody dry. And everyone was like, hooray, MOSE is here, everything's good. And then in December, like you're talking about, the officials were like, meh, we don't know if this is going to be that bad. We think we might be okay. Let's keep an eye on it. And by time they kept an eye on it, it was kind of like, uh-oh, too late to raise the alarms. Even if they did, which they do, it was like, too late, we're already flooded. Like,
apparently it was terrible flooding.
Yeah,
too.
like the worst pictures in like 50, 60, 70 years, something like that. Yeah, absolutely terrible. One of the other neat things that I think people really appreciate about this system is that so far it's cost over 6 billion euros to put in. And they're like, so again, this is a bunch of like devices that, stick up in the air, block the water. But really the $6 billion is because of bribery, corruption in the government, and like inflating prices to get around that sort of stuff. Now, I'm not going to use the word mafia, but it sure feels that way to me. I don't know.
It was shady.
$6 billion. And since Venice is this amazing tourist place that's beautiful and everyone wants to see it preserved, one of the requirements is that this sucker can't be up all the time, like a logical person might think. They have to be able to, like you said, raise up and lower down into their housing so that no one can ever see that they're there unless they're being used in one of these high tide emergencies.
You ready to wrap up some fun facts, or do you have other stuff, James?
I need some fun facts.
Okay. 417 bridges in Venice. 72 of them are private. There's over 177 individual canals. The largest is called the Grand Canal. It actually splits it in two. I'm sure you were on it.
Pain in the bum. Yes.
Oh, it is.
Well, like bridges. My legs don't want to go up bridges.
There's 350 gondolas, and there's only 400 gondoliers. These are the men only. Other than there's a single female gondolier.
Yep.
Apparently she was like the daughter of a gondolier.
Yeah.
They only allow 2 to 3 gondoliers new per year. And it's actually a license. You got to get a license for like a taxi.
400 hours of training. And you have to pass an exam on Venetian history and landmarks.
To row a boat and sing?
And apparently they make a killing.
Yeah, apparently they make about 100 euros a year, which is, I guess, I don't know what that ends up being. It's probably like
100,000 euros.
Like, 100,000 euros a year. So that's like $130,000 US, I think. So one of the first women graduates of a university actually graduated from a Venetian university. Elaine La Cruza Coronado got a PhD in Venice. She was the very first female to ever graduate from a university. The first public casino way back in 1836 that was managed by the government was actually in Venice. And what else? I think that might be it for... Oh, gondolas have to be black. They're not allowed to be any other color.
Yeah, and they do warn you that there are like unofficial ones out there that might try and scam you, so you have to be careful. Did you know that skateboarding, roller skating, and bicycling is not allowed in Venice?
I heard, but why wouldn't you be allowed to ride a bike? I could see the other ones because they're a bit of a nuisance sometimes, but why can't you ride a bike?
I think it's because it's so crowded. The streets are very tight. You're hitting people, things like that. But I also think they're worried about, much like skateboarding and roller skating and stuff everywhere, like it damaging the stones and stuff. Also, I had one other one. Oh, I saw that as early as 2030, so 9 years from now, they expect no people to live in Venice anymore, or like such an insignificant number that we don't even report it. And then last but not least, I talked about how you just might as well poop straight into the canals because that's what you're doing anyways. Fun fact about the amazing MOSE system that's keeping everything from flooding. When those walls are up, your flushing doesn't go back out to the ocean.
Stay in.
They just sit there until those walls go down. So they expect that this wall system is going to have to start being used more and more, and maybe for longer periods of time.
Yeah, what would they do? They'll have to come with some inside plumbing or something. They'll have to figure out their plumbing problems.
Good luck to all of you.
How did I not catch that they don't have like a real plumbing system?
Gross?
That's really gross.
So gross. So right now, also, I did want to put out there that it floods regularly. Now, we're talking about super awful damaging floods with what we're talking about, but it's a very common occurrence, like to the point that they have walkways set up that they put out every day for people to walk around.
Mm-hmm. And apparently everybody has boots.
Everyone has giant like fishing boots. Yeah. This happens 4 to 5 times a year. And we're not saying like 4 to 5 days a year. We're talking like seasonal stretches that this happens. And all of the restaurants, all of the shops get shut down because everything's flooded. And then once the tide goes out again, it drains and you go back to your life. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, any other fun facts for you?
Marco Polo was from there.
That was interesting. Yes.
And so was Casanova.
I saw his house. It was interesting stuff.
Marco Polo or Casanova's?
Marco Polo's. Okay. I did not know about Casanova.
Did you close your eyes and go, Marco?
I probably did. I'm
sure you did.
A little ashamed, but yes. All right. Hopefully you all enjoyed this, learned a little bit about why Venice is flooding, why the ocean is rising, the amazing €6 billion wall that they're building, and, just all sorts of fun facts about Venice. If you have anything else, please email us at unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com. And until next time.
See ya.